And here we go. Safe for Democracy, the United States and World War I, 1916 to 1920, Part 1, Introduction. So I like to start off with this particular illustration from the 1880s, early 1890s. And here you see Uncle Sam, and he is essentially providing the goods and services, raw materials and finished goods to our European allies, Germany, England, France. And you can see the types of things that we are at this particular point really quite successful at: clothing and chemicals and agricultural implements, trains, all kinds of stuff. And the cartoon, of course, is called The Greatest Department Store. And this is really how the United States wishes to view itself as we come into the 20th century. We don't want to get involved in European entanglements, and so what we want to do is just basically sell to everybody. And really much of this period leading up to the end of the 1920s is most of our foreign policy as well as our domestic policy is focused on businesses, on corporations, on international corporations, on the import and the export of materials into and out of the United States. And we see a time when there are a lot of new products being introduced, and not just new inventions, but foodstuffs that were never familiar or available in the United States become available and are marketed quite heavily. This is This is the United Fruit Company out of Boston. They also have an amazing office down in New Orleans. The front of the facade of the building has marble carved fruit running up and down across the doors. It's very beautiful. But anyway, this is actually a little booklet that they published, the short history of the banana and a few recipes for its use, primarily just to introduce to Americans what a banana is and how you can use it in a variety of ways. And you might think that's rather strange, but I'll give you a personal story from my own background. My German relatives back in World War II, they had been in the country. Well, this was during World War I. There were food shortages, and there were supplemental food sent by the government to various and sundry parts of the country, and one of those was the Dakotas, where I grew up. And my first-generation German relatives were given several cases of grapefruit, and they did not know what it was. They thought it was an orange. They cut one open. It didn't look like an orange. It didn't look like it was ripe or anything. They tasted it. It was very, very sour. So they gave all of it to the pigs. It was a product they had never seen before. And so I know that's hard to take into account, but I often send my world history students and my sociocultural anthropology students or my race students to places like the Asia Market or the Noodle Bowl or places like that to go shopping, because they see products that they've never seen before. And it's something I suggest everybody do. Go to a foreign market and just see all the stuff you didn't even know existed. And this is where the reason I use this particular image here at this point is that this is where that definition of a banana republic comes from. It's a republic. It's another country that's so weak that our military and our corporations are able to basically do whatever they want. And that's really what defines a banana republic. Someplace that someone like Dole Bananas or Dole Pineapples or one of those companies or the United Fruit Company can actually dictate terms to the host country. We also viewed ourselves at this particular point as kind of the world's traffic cop. And this is an illustration from 1905. It is from January of that year. And it's called The World's Constable. And it's basically showing here Theodore Roosevelt in the middle. And you see he's got, in one side, he's got a big roll of papers that says arbitration. The other side, he says, tell her troubles to the policemen. And so on one side here, you see the European powers and even the Asian powers. You see China and Japan and Russia and England and Germany and France and all that are on one side. And on the other, you see the poor countries. And this is really when we begin to do diplomacy across the country, across international borders, where we begin to use money to buy influence overseas, where we use our military overseas. And it really is the kind of that's what he means by walk softly but carry a big stick. Negotiate, walk softly, discuss, make options, but you've always got the military behind you. And the turn of the century is a huge period of change. By the middle of the 19th century, the patent office wanted to shut down, thinking that nothing else could be invented. And in 1844, we get the telegraph and a whole bunch of other stuff, all just piling on, the McCormick Reaper, etc. And so as we enter the 20th century, we are still in this mode of rapid innovation, new products. Here you see from 1910, this is an airplane flying down the street in Washington, D.C. Within just a few years, that little piece of paper and balsa wood will turn into a highly efficient and very deadly fighting machine in World War I. So let's talk a little bit about the Roosevelt Corollary. The Roosevelt Corollary basically says that it is the right or the responsibility of the United States to intervene to stabilize the economic affairs of small states in the Caribbean and Central America. This is an extension of the Monroe Doctrine, and basically it says we have the right and the obligation to actively participate in the politics and the economies of our immediate neighbors. And so one of the things that Teddy Roosevelt wants to do is build the Panama Canal. And we had tried for years to negotiate with Colombia because we wanted to cut off the really longest part of the sea journey from, say, New York to San Francisco by finding a way to cut across the continent rather than have to go all the way down past the tip of South America and come back up. And so we essentially divided Colombia into two countries. We created the country of Panama. We then claimed the Panama Zone. We then, with our own puppet government in place, we were able then to build the canal, and we continued to control it well up into the 1980s and early 90s. At which point we then did turn the zone back to the Panamanians. But that was almost 100 years after we stole part of Colombia to create a new country called Panama, so we could build the canal. Understand, technology was nowhere near what it is today. These canals were dug and built by hand. This was in swamps and very humid and bad conditions. Malaria, scarlet fever, yellow fever, all of these things were just rampant in these swamps. And here you can see the map, and you can see really why this was the perfect place to build the canal. You can see that a big portion of this is a series of rivers, and that it goes into a lake, which covers a huge area, and then it connects from sea to sea. Now, the reason that it has to be the way that it is, and the reason that you have these, you see this little orange where it says the locks, the two oceans, even though it's really only one ocean, the Atlantic and the Pacific. So you have the ocean, which is all of the oceans, and then we have four separate oceans within that: the Atlantic, the Pacific, the Arctic, and the Indian. Those oceans are part of the ocean. But what's interesting is the Atlantic and the Pacific are at different levels, and so you have to either raise the ships or lower them in order to put them at the sea level on either side of the canal. And so we had to build those as well as everything else. Now, prior to this, prior to building the canal, you either went around the Cape at the tip of South America, or you would get off right around here and then take buses and mules to get across and around this lake, take boats for part of it and do all that stuff, and eventually get to the other side where you would pick up a different ship and then go up the rest of the way. But this is a period when we use a number of ways to participate in our neighbors' activities. We send the military to Nicaragua to protect our oil interests. We do the same in other countries. We did it in Liberia. We've done it all. Really, most of it, though, is Latin America and East Asia, although some of this also continues into other parts of the world as well. So Taft uses what we refer to as dollar diplomacy. It is where we use our economic power to guarantee loans to other countries. That makes them in debt to us, and then we're able to pretty much make any demands we want. Woodrow Wilson, who we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit, he's a very problematic president. Seemingly progressive on one side, based on what's in the 14-point speech, which we'll talk about when we get to the end of the war, or when we get to the war, our entrance to the war. And yet he is an avowed racist. He is a Confederate sympathizer. He really believes He really believed the wrong side won the war. He is extremely problematic when it comes to race relationships in this country, and the way that he treated many of our neighbors. And he uses this concept of moral imperialism, or what Rudyard Kipling referred to when he was talking about the Spanish-American War and our invasion of the Philippines, the white man's burden. And this is the American idea that we have a responsibility to those who are, quote-unquote, less fortunate than ourselves, people of color, especially brown people and black people. We have a responsibility to share with them both Jesus and industrialization. And this really is the white man's burden, according to thought at the beginning of the 20th century, that white people were superior, and that as such they had an obligation to at least attempt to provide ways for the lesser races, as white people saw it, to pull themselves up. And of course you couldn't do that without the assistance of white people. And it's important to understand that we in this country have a long history of invasion and military intervention and all kinds of stuff. This is a map that covers basically from the late 1800s, the last decade or two of the 19th century, through about 1935, 1940. And each of these that you see on the screen there, that's on the map, is an invasion or other military intervention or other international political or military campaign that benefits us and really infringes on the sovereignty of other countries. One of the things that I always like to ask my students, especially in the first half of U.S. history, is how many times has the United States invaded Mexico? And they're shocked to hear a total of 8 times. We actually held it. We held Mexico City, which is a long way from the border. And so it's sometimes surprising how much intervention we've actually had. And this doesn't include things post-World War II, and there's a whole bunch of stuff in Nicaragua and Panama and Costa Rica and Ecuador that hopefully we'll talk about later in the semester. And that wraps up part 1, Safe for Democracy.